It's my great personal pleasure to introduce Dr. Joel Kovel. He's an activist thinker, a prolific author, and he's professionally skilled in several disciplines: medicine, psychoanalysis, and the social sciences. And he writes, if you have looked at any of his books, with literary elegance. People who are alive to our surrounding social and natural world, who take to heart the equal right of people for justice and peace in every part of the globe, people who are concerned for the very survival of humanity and our natural world, I say with confidence, you will find stimulus and insight in the thinking and the writing of Joel Kovel. This evening, Joel shares his thoughts on Zionism, why it must and how it can be overcome. Overcoming Zionism is the title of his most recent book. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Joel Kovel.
The title of the book in German is Das Unbehagen in der Kultur. Unbehagen is the word that translates in English as discontent, and it means unease. It means a difficult to define feeling of badness and wrongness. It means something that persists from within and brings down, in Freud's view, a whole civilization. Now, to put it very, very brutally simply, what Freud was saying is that in the history of humanity, in order to bring people together, they had to suppress their aggressive instincts, which would mutually destroy each other. And that's the part I don't go along with, but will not discuss further now. And in doing so, we're burdened by an increasing sense of guilt, that the more civilization proceeds, the more guilt-ridden people become. And that guilt doesn't have any rational outcome because it's based upon inner feelings more than it is based upon what is done, and it just makes life sour, nasty, and unworthy of being a happy one. And I wanted to apply that to the subject at hand, which does interest me and should interest us all, namely the question of the state of Israel and the ideology which animates it, Zionism, which, as Mordecai most correctly points out, is a sorely undertreated subject in our world, thanks to a very, very efficient and powerful system of suppression, which the writing of this book was principally designed to challenge and itself overcome. I felt that we are deprived of a decent debate on this very, very vitally important subject in the Western world, especially in my country, the United States, but also I do believe in Canada as well. And being so deprived, we are unable to come to grips with it, to understand it fully, and as a result, great harm is done to many people in the world. I'll expand on that later, and even catastrophic events may unfold in the form of terrible wars. But I did feel that there was something in Freud's insight, that there was a basic discontent, and that it has to do with conscience, sense of guilt, and that it leads to a sense of a pervasive malaise, which can have, however, different outcomes that pervades the history of the state of Israel. And it's a rather complex notion, this, and it has to be itself grounded historically, because it is a very, very long and intricate history that the Jewish people have undergone, I myself being one of us, or them, however you want to parse it. And I would say that amongst the particular contributions of the Israelites and then the Hebrews and the Jews throughout their early years was a development of a form of society which was regulated by guilt feelings. And there are two basic ways in which human beings regulate social interchanges, and one is through shame feelings and one is through guilt feelings. That's a bit of an oversimplification. But the guilt cultures originally, I think, stemmed from this small tribe at the eastern end of the Mediterranean and became generalized through the development of Hebraic civilization, which then passed on into Christian civilization and Western civilization as a whole, so that the notion of guilt as a regulating impulse in human society is by no means generalized throughout all human societies. Most societies are shame-driven, and where prestige or honor or the like is the most sought after mental desideratum, but that the guilt-inducing cultures of which Judaism is sort of the originator are extremely important in the development of our own civilization and important in the development of the State of Israel. And rather than go on and on about this, of course I will return to it, let me say that when I first began to write seriously on this question and to bring before the public my views about the State of Israel, the first article I wrote, which was published in 2002, I mean, I had written other articles beforehand, but they were for scholarly journals. The first article in a public journal, which was in the American journal Tikkun, was called Zionism's Bad Conscience. And so what I was doing was taking Freud's insight about the guilt culture, but putting it more in the question of conscience, of the way in which we regulate our inner lives and the way in which our value systems are structured. And I felt that there was an abiding sense of badness about them. That word bad has a number of meanings. It could mean wrong, it could mean not feeling right, it could be malfunctioning, but I thought all of those concepts apply. And that I don't think you can understand what goes on in the State of Israel and through Zionism, unless we understand that bad conscience. But of course, I'm not making this as a simple mental construction, but rather I see the bad conscience arising through certain very fundamental contradictions which cannot be overcome unless the basic assumptions of Zionism are overcome. Now, I'll just mention some examples of this, not directly, because there are no direct evidences of a bad conscience, but rather of the way in which it affects moral behavior. Okay, there's a certain pervasive set of disturbances in moral behavior. And I'll give you two quotations from a very famous leader of Israel and a Zionist, the well-known leader, Prime Minister of Israel, Golda Meir, who became Prime Minister, I believe it was in 1969, and I have two quotes from Golda Meir. The first is this. Shortly before she became Prime Minister, she said, and this was in the New York Times, quote, "It was not as though there was a Palestinian people in Palestine considering itself as a Palestinian people, and we came and threw them out and took their country away from them. They did not exist." They did not exist. The very people who were displaced did not exist. The second quote, also from Golda Meir, I don't remember the year, is the following. She said, "I will never forgive the Arabs for forcing us to kill them." Wow, that's interesting, isn't it? Now, starting with that second quote, you can see it's a very bizarre statement. On the other hand, those of you who had Jewish mothers might recognize something. I mean, you certainly would not say, this has nothing to do with Jewish life, you know. I mean, that kind of this excessive focus on the notion of guilt without being able to resolve it or even name it properly, but rather turning it around and blaming others and then and wallowing in a certain kind of pride that you are willing to look honestly at the questions of wrongdoing and that you're morally superior. All these kinds of things cluster around Jewish being. They clustered around mine. I grew up in a fairly conventional, from the outside, family in Brooklyn, born in 1936. So I was 12 years old and the State of Israel formed. And I went through the usual Jewish rituals. I was bar mitzvah, etc. But because of peculiarities, which I can, if you want, I'll tell you later, I had a falling away and didn't feel myself very much part of it. And over the years, became very much identified with the left, and in the course of all that formed the following critique of Israel and Zionism. But setting that aside, I certainly recognize in my own upbringing a very constant refrain, which was, as Jewish people, we were, quote, the light unto the nations, that we were a people who lived by high ethical standards. We were people who, for whom justice was the highest value, and the like, that our very highest of high holidays, which we're having, even as I speak, we're approaching anyway, is the atonement for sins, that we can, that this is the necessary part of Jewish being and Jewish living. Now, from a psychological standpoint, what's necessary about it is that it's an element of what you would call identity, and identity means your sense of being and belonging to a group, that you define yourself through that group and through its tradition. And being that way, you're feeling yourself that you don't fully exist, that you're cast out of that group, that you don't exist as a full human being unless you follow that principle. So I just want to emphasize it's this notion of high ethical standards, of being the light unto the nations and so forth, of the essential virtue of the Jewish people is not a trivial belief. It's by any means. It's a fundamental foundation, if you like, of the identity, and hence one's whole sense of belonging as a human being to a coherent tradition. Now, I hold that notion is real and persistent. On the other hand, it seems to be contradicted in real practices that have to do with tremendous transgressions that are undertaken also in the name of a notion of being Jewish. And that has to do with the origins of the State of Israel and through the ideology of Zionism. Zionism was a response taken by Jewish people in Central and Eastern Europe towards the close of the 19th century in response to a gathering sense of threat that was afflicting Western civilization as a whole. And in the context of what was undoubtedly a very uncomfortable feeling that they didn't belong in European society, that although they had come a long way since the so-called emancipations of the late Enlightenment and the early modern era in the 19th century, that nonetheless there was still no sense of belonging. And more importantly, that there was a gathering storm, that there was something terrible was about to happen. I think any sensitive observer in Europe, and you can see it written in European culture of the late 19th century, sees this gathering crisis. And Zionism was a response to that gathering crisis by saying, we will take this feeling that we don't belong and we will master it by making for ourselves a national entity and a nation state in the lands of historic Palestine. Now, they weren't always defined that way, because sometimes the notion of forming that state could be referred to places as far as Uganda or Madagascar or the like, but it was clear that there was no real valence. There was nothing to really pull Jews towards that idea. And mind you, there weren't that many Jews who even believed in that idea at the very beginning. There was no real valence except the lands of historic Palestine. And the reason for that was that the foundation of the sense of nationhood that the Jews were undertaking was grounded in the only thing that held them together that was common to all of them, which was their biblical origins. And this has as its corollary a very salient fact, namely that there was no actual national feeling that could unify all Jews at that time, simply because for many centuries they had lived in many countries around the world, not just after having been expelled from Rome, but by the conquests of the late 1st century, the early 2nd century, not Rome, from Palestine, by the conquest of Rome, who destroyed the temple. But really even before then, because Jews had been scattered, there had been Jews in what is now Iraq, was then, Assyria, Samaria, in Mesopotamia. From the time of King Nebuchadnezzar in 800 before the Christian era, there were Jews in what is now Persia, from even before then. And the Jews lived in those places. and saw themselves as people of those places who happened to be Jewish. The greatest Jew of the Middle Ages, Maimonides, for example, lived in Spain and then moved to what is now Alexandria, where he became the physician to the caliph there. He always considered himself a Spaniard who just happened to be Jewish. He didn't say, I'm primarily a Jewish person. I'm a Spaniard, I live in North Africa. That's how it was. So the actual national identities of Jews could not be grounded in what actually makes nationhood, namely sharing a common territory, sharing a common history around that territory, such as the Irish people developed a sense of Irish nationalism, the French people, and so on, the Gauls people. Now, this can be complicated from land to land. We needn't get into the theory of nationalism, except to say that for what the Zionists were posing was actually nationalism in reverse. That is to say, there was no nationalism to begin with, but they would create nationalism through the attainment of a territory. And the attainment of the territory could only be regulated and guided by what actually held them together, which was the biblical books of the Old Testament. And so, with all of its embedded guilt culture, which I needn't get into now for lack of time. Now, as you know, there is an extreme problem here, and was from the very beginning, because although a number of the early Zionists believed, as did Golda Meir, well, there were no people there, it's this open country, it's a land without people for a people without land, as the saying went. That was strictly contrary to fact. There were indeed quite a few people there. They were of Arabs, they were some of them Christians, many of them Muslims. They had a complex society. They were subjects of the Ottoman Empire. They had their problems, but they were very real. And this is the key thing, in order to fulfill the nationhood, these people had to be moved aside. That was the reality. Now, you could be a Zionist and move to Israel, or not Israel then, move to Palestine. You could found a pious Hebraic settlement. You could practice your religion. There was no problem with that. They were welcomed for many, many generations to do that. They would have kept being welcomed. Originally, they were welcomed indeed by the Arab inhabitants of the land. Oh, that's fine, because we have a common background. We're both from the Abrahamic religions, and so on and so forth. There was no problem with that. There was a terrible problem, however, if you decided you wanted to form a nation state, okay? Because a state is an instrument of force, okay? A state does not exist unless it controls violence and makes the violence legitimate. That's the definition of Max Weber. A state is an organization that has a monopoly on legitimate violence. States can kill, and that's an interesting thing. It shows the importance of conscience in human existence. All right? So the necessity of making that state happen means that you had to create violence and also a sense of legitimacy. Now, this was aggravated in the case of the Zionists because of the tremendous role that moral authenticity played in the historical and emotional and collective lives of the Jewish people. Hence, they were facing a tremendous contradiction right from the start. And this contradiction led to various distortions, among which was there are no Palestinians there. So what Golda Meir was saying in 1969, fully 20 years after the formation of the State of Israel, was what some of the Zionists were saying early on. But the fact of the matter is that, of course, there were Palestinians there. They were there in great number. They vastly outnumbered the Jews. They had their own class society. They had their own tradition. They were fully formed human beings. However, in order to deal with the moral contradictions of the Zionist project, you had to somehow erase the fact that they were equivalent human beings. You could not afford to see them as human beings if you were going to take their land from them and at the same time maintain your identity as a virtuous and indeed higher civilizing force. And that matter persisted and throughout the history of Zionism. It originally was a matter of taking land by buying it through absentee landlords of the Ottoman Empire. It became eventually A question of military confrontation after the 1920s revealed that there was going to really be an explosion. This military confrontation grew in scope and scale. I obviously can't go into the details of the history. They're available in many excellent texts, including texts written by Israelis who are, interestingly, much more capable of understanding this part of the history than the peoples of the United States are.